do believe we're now live. Just put a little message in the chat so everybody knows. Sometimes have to wait just they start a little slowly, these webinars, sometimes, while I just take a bit of time to make sure that everyone can see and hear me. It's funny, we always have a mixture at this point of some people that can see what I'm doing and some people that can't yet. Just going to type a message for the people that can't see yet. I'm just sitting here watching the chat messages roll by. Gradually, bit by bit, the webinar starts to pop up on people's screens. Jim the cat is in here actually. At some point it's probably going to want to get out, so we're probably going to have that again. The sound higher, that's a little bit difficult for me at the moment. I think I've got it as high as I can. Unfortunately, it's quite difficult with these webinars because I have the mic. I'll try and talk a bit louder. I have the mic set somewhere near me, but I also need enough room to paint. So it's kind of a little bit difficult. What you see is me sitting in front of my easel, but I'm actually surrounded by laptops and cameras and microphones and all kinds of paraphernalia and leads everywhere that I hope I'm not going to trip over, or something will go horribly wrong in the middle of the webinar. But let's start now anyway. I think it's probably fair to say that everyone can see me. If you can't hear anything at all, the sound is coming through, so try turning your sound right up on whatever you're watching this on your laptop or tablet or whatever it is. Someone's put in the chat, how do I refresh? I only have a reload tab. Try that. I'm not sure what the reload tab is, but usually if you hit, I don't know what kind of, if you're on a laptop, if you're on a PC, if you hit Control R, or if you're on a Mac, if you hit Command R, that should work. Let's remember that not everybody is as technically savvy. Yeah, okay. It sounds like everybody's doing okay. Most people can see and hear me now. So this is a follow-on really from last week's webinar when I did a little still life, which some of you would have been here for. And I basically painted through a step-by-step process of a way to do site-side still life. This webinar this week is a little bit different in that I'm concentrating on just one area, and we're just going to be looking at values today. Now, the reason I've decided to do one webinar just on values is because I struggled so much with values when I was trying to teach myself to draw and paint realistically. And when I found some good information and some good ways to practice, and I improved my values, I found that it made a really, really big difference to the sense of realism and depth and light and form that I was getting into the drawings and the paintings that I was doing. And I thought, well, this is very interesting. It's obvious that value is one of the most important things in creating realistic work. And I think that's borne out by the practice that I've done since. And off the back of sorting out values, color became much easier for me too after that point. Now, what happened was I'd been doing, I think I kind of had an idea. I think most people know that values are important. And I'd been hanging around art forums quite a bit, as you do, trying to stay out of the arguments and learn as much as I could. I came across someone called Graydon Parish on a forum, and he was talking about Munsell. And after some time of hearing him talk about this stuff, and if you've come across his work, you'll know he's an absolutely brilliant academic painter. He was giving a lecture in the US on Munsell and how it could be used for painters, for artists. So I went along to this lecture and had the good fortune to talk to Graydon a little bit afterwards. And he basically put me onto Munsell, which is what made the difference for me. So I'm going to try and illustrate that kind of story a little bit of what happened. And I'm going to try and do something I didn't try and do last week. So this is one of those things that it'll either work really nice or it won't work at all. I'm going to try and I've put just a couple of slides together, of images of the kind of work I was doing at the time, which I think will hopefully help to illustrate what it is that I'm talking about. So let's have a look. I'm just going to try and share my screen now. Looks like it's probably worked to me. So this is quite a fairly early value study of mine. Obviously not a particularly strong one. I hadn't gained much fluency with charcoal at the time. I knew values were important, but I didn't really know a good way to approach them. And it was very much a kind of a trial and error approach I was taking. I continued with these kind of value studies. I actually did a huge amount of these, probably in the hundreds. None of them took very long to do, and I was very frustrated because I wasn't really making an awful lot of headway with them. So then, as I say, I came across Munsell and took away the information that I'd picked up from the lecture that Graydon gave, which was mostly about color, but he said some very interesting things about value and about the Munsell value scale. So I got hold of the Munsell student book, which I'll show you in a second, which has most of a Munsell value scale in it. And the tiny square tabs that you can see on this picture here are actual Munsell values from the value scale that comes in the Munsell student book. The little kind of tags next to them with the holes drilled in them I made, and they're made out of MDF and painted to match the Munsell scale. And this was the first, when I actually put those tags together, I began to develop my sensitivity to value, because I matched those tags as closely as I possibly could to the values that I was seeing. And it took me quite a long time, but I found that I got better at it with practice. And then I tubed up each of these values into paint. And what I then did was I got hold of some cubes and spheres. And this was on the recommendation of Graydon. Obviously, a lot of artists and teachers recommend painting with cubes and spheres, drawing cubes and spheres, and it's quite a standard way to practice. But when you put it with a Munsell scale, or with any good value scale will do for this, it doesn't have to be Munsell. When you add it to a value scale and you practice with it like this, some very interesting things start to happen. So after, I'm going to illustrate some of the exercises that I did. And obviously I'm going to paint one or two of them live as we go today. So I want to, after this point, I want to show you, this is the first value study that I did, which is in kind of a layering technique with charcoal and chalk that I did after I'd done a bunch of practice with the Munsell value scale. I gave up color for about a year or two, I think, something like that. And I really decided I was going to nail a value. And I think you can see in this one that already there's something of a quantum leap in the feeling of light and reality and depth over the first couple of value studies I showed. So I carried on with these. This is the same medium. It's chalk and charcoal mixed together, almost like painting, very like painting, and with a similar value range as well. and kept on going working on those kind of value studies until eventually I moved, at the point when I produced this one, I moved back into paint again. Now let's see if I can come back to the camera again. Now, hopefully, sorry, I just need to redo a couple of things here. Hopefully that all worked for you, and you could see all of those slides. Let me know in the chat if anything didn't come up there. But that should give you a fair idea of the difference that the kind of practice that I did with those little cubes and spheres made to the way that I understood value, and that then translated immediately back into paint. So I said I was going to show you the Munsell student book. Now, this is the version of it I've got paint all over it, of course, because it's been used quite a lot. Now, I recommend getting hold of this if you haven't already, because it's got within it, again, mine is very well thumbed and used, but it's got within it on the first page, these are those little squares of values that were in that picture that I showed earlier on when I was making the value scales. There's lots of other color information in here too, obviously. You get a bunch of these pages where each one is a single hue, so all of these little chips are the same hue. It goes from value up this axis, from dark to light, and chroma, saturation, and brightness of color, from gray to the highest chroma over on this side. But it was really just the value scale, just this bit, that I worked for quite a while. And you can pick up this book for about $30, I think, secondhand still, on eBay or on Amazon. And I really think, for me, it was worth its weight in gold because of the work I did with the value scale. So sometime after that, I got hold of what they call the Munsell Big Book, which is horrendously expensive, but has a lot more detail and it has glossy chips. And this is the value page from the Munsell Big Book, which shows you a lot more detail. Like, this is the same value scale. Interestingly, I'm missing number 4. It's in the house somewhere, no idea where. Cats, children, who knows? That one's disappeared. And these are kind of increments. That's like 3, 3 1/4, 3 1/2, 3 3/4. I tend not to use these at all. I think with these things you can get a bit too over obsessed with it, and you really want to use it as an overall guide, and I'm going to show you in a minute how I do that. But this is the bit that I use mostly, which is the Munsell values from 1 to 9. Now, I've already started to rough out a little bit here what I'm going to paint for you today. I'm going to get as far as I can through this study, and for anyone who wasn't in the Still Life webinar, Site Size webinar that I did last week, this is a really basic setup I've got here. Okay, I've got a shadow box made out of black foam core here, which is just taped together, just rectangles of black foam core cut out and taped together. I've got what I call a little framer or viewfinder here, which is an idea I got from Harold Speed, which has a thread grid, which is mirrored by the pencil grid, which I've gridded out on here, which basically is really good for your kind of first level of drawing accuracy. I'm going to be working site size when I do this. It's very like doing barred drawing, where you would have a single plumb line coming down, except obviously there's more lines, but the principle is exactly the same. It makes it much easier and quicker to start to rough the painting out. And if you haven't done a lot of judging of distances and drawing accuracy practice before, I think this is a really good way to start. This is just a simple Winsor & Newton. Let's see if I've got a pad around here somewhere. Oh, I've put it somewhere, I'm not sure where. It's just, you know, those sketch pads you can get of oil painting paper. I tend not to use anything very expensive for these simple little studies. And that's about it. Then the drawing board is held on the easel. The viewfinder is taped to the back of the drawing board. So basically what I'm going to try and do is replicate or get as close as I can to what I can see through here on here. Now at the moment, you're seeing this from the camera I've got here so you can actually see me talking. So it's a very different angle than the angle I'll be looking at it from when I actually paint. So I've got another camera which I'll switch to when I start painting, which will show a little more of what's actually in here. It'll be slightly closer to the viewpoint that I'm taking when I paint, but not exact, obviously, because then my head would be right in front of the camera and you wouldn't be able to see anything at all. So the camera is like, if you can imagine it, whilst I'm painting, I'll be on the other side over there, and the camera will be like just by the side of me here. So I've got to be careful I don't knock it while I'm doing anything, or it won't look very good. So I think that's probably a reasonably fair overview. Is there anything else I want to go over? I'll probably talk some more about the detail when we get a bit further through. And what I'm going to do, the problem is for me, when I start to paint, I can no longer see what's happening on the screen, which makes it pretty much impossible for me to keep up with the chat. So if you have questions, what would be most useful, what would work best for all of us, I think, is if you can maybe make a note of them, if you want to make sure you don't forget them. And when we get to the end of the webinar, as far as we want to go with, as far as I get with this study in the time we have, then we'll open it up to questions in the chat. And if you have anything you want to ask me, it's better to ask me then, because if you ask whilst we go through and I'm painting, unfortunately, I won't be able to keep up with the chat and see what's happening. So it's much easier if you do it at the end. But feel free to chat with each other whilst I'm diddling about with the painting. And also, as I said last week, when I actually get painting, I mean, if you paint yourself, so you'll know what it's like. Sometimes you get lost in what you're doing, and painting is one of those things. I find it a challenge, let's say, to talk and paint at the same time. So there might be the odd moment when I kind of zone out a little bit and just paint. So another thing I want to show you before I actually start and switch over to the other camera is my palette. So it's fairly simple, okay, because I'm just doing a value study here. So what I've got here, I've got 2 blobs of white. I generally put 2 out just in case. I always find I run out of white and tend to need a little bit more. And I've also put an extra blob here anyway, because I'm going to try something in a minute, which I don't normally do, but will hopefully be useful to you. And then we go basically down the Munsell scale. I haven't got 9 here because I've run out, and I've some time ago, and I found that I didn't really need it anyway, because I can easily mix. This is titanium white, and in Munsell terms, it's about 9.5, usually maybe slightly higher. So I can pretty much mix between those if I like. So I've got 8, 7, 6, a gap there, which I'll get onto in a second, where the 5 should be 4, 3, 2, 1, and then black. And I've also got burnt umber here, because if you just mix black and titanium white together, you'll get a very bluish grey, which is no problem. I mean, you can do value studies with that kind of bluish grey. But the Munsell neutral scale is just that, it's a neutral scale. So there's no hue information in there at all, it's just value. And they look rather different, and you need to warm up the mix that you get with just black and white a little bit in order to get, hit a Munsell chip, Munsell value accurately. So I've run out of 5. Okay, I always have these tubed up. Here's number 4. But 5, unfortunately, I've run out of. But fortunately, actually, because what I'm going to do to show you first is how I would go about matching one of these chips. It's going to be slightly challenging to do that, because I'm going to have to hold my palette up and do it as I go, or you won't be able to see what I'm doing. But let's give it a go, and we'll see how it works out. So I'm going to get this is my Munsell 5 chip. I could also use the one from the student book, but this is just a little bit easier. And I find a handy way to do it is to get a tiny little bit of blue tack, which I find outrageously useful to have hanging around, and then stick the value chip. I'm going to try and match on here. Now, because I need to warm up the value a little bit, this is something I learned from Graydon, and it's I think he learned it from his teacher, I believe it was Michael Aviano, and it's an outrageously useful thing. is, rather than mixing the grey somewhere near and then trying to warm it up by just chucking in a warmer colour like burnt sienna or burnt umber, a much better approach is to mix both values separately. So you mix your black and white, and then you mix your burnt umber and white until they're the same value, and then you mix some of the burnt umber mix into the black and white mix until you get about the right neutral kind of value here. So first thing I want to do is to make a black and white mix. This is now, I haven't actually tried doing this before. Hopefully you can see this well enough on the video. If it's a little bit too far away from you, you could try going full screen. Or I wonder if I can, actually let's try switching to the other camera. And I'll just try and mix this value holding the palette up like this, and let's see how it goes. I think that sounds like a pretty good idea. A quick question there from someone: do you arrange your palette by value? If I'm doing value studies, yes, definitely, because it means that I can mix easily in between them. You know, so if I want, like, I mean, that's 3 and 4, but the world isn't binary, isn't kind of chopped off like this into particular values. You know, if I want something in between there, then I can just mix between them very easily, and I find that having these steps is fine. Incidentally, I generally have a string of neutrals like this on the palette when I'm painting anyway, if I'm just doing an ordinary painting. Oh, someone's asked me, Owen, you've asked a question, don't you balance the whites? Can you hold that question? Because I'm not sure what you mean, but can you hold that question and ask it again in the Q&A? And I'll try and remember to bring it up again and to ask you what you mean about that. But what I'm going to do now, hopefully, if it all works, is to switch to the other camera, which will mean that you'll be able to see much more closely what I'm doing. Yeah, here we go. So now hopefully you can see the palette much more closely. It's going to jiggle about, I'm afraid, because I've just got to hold it up like this. What I should really do is get hold of one of David Cassin's new parallel palettes, which would make life much easier. But here I've got titanium white, okay. So I'll pick up some black. And what I'm going to do is try and mix black and white until I get something like this value here. This is one of those things that you get better at with practice, but I think it's a really good thing to do. I think you can actually buy Munsell neutral scales now, ready tubed up, but I certainly wouldn't do that because just the act of mixing up these values and getting them to match these target values as closely as you can really kind of stretches and develops your sensitivity to value. So I'm just going to pick up a little bit of that and dab it on there and see how close I am. Actually, I've been lucky. That's really, really close. Sometimes it takes a few goes to get it close, but that looks all right. I'd hold the palette closer to the camera, but it's a fixed focus. Otherwise, the focus tends to jump around while I'm painting, so I can't do that, unfortunately. But hopefully that you can see well enough that the little dab that I put on here is very close in value. What you probably can't see is that it's slightly bluish. So the next thing I need to do is to get a bit more white. Mix it with some burnt umber. You can use burnt sienna for this as well. And I'm going to get this to about the same, well, actually as exactly as I can, to the same value. One of the things about doing things on webinars like this is that I'm mindful of the time. So things that I might spend an hour over, I might only be able to spend 10 minutes or so, which makes life slightly complicated, but we'll see. And what I'm doing at this point that you can't see is I've just put this little dab on here and I'm squinting my eyes to kind of get a check of the value. this is quite unfortunate because I think I pretty much nailed it with that one mix as well. And it would have been more instructive if I'd had to have a lot of different goes. But basically you can see what I've got: two little paint piles of the same value, one cool and one warm. So I'm going to leave a little bit of that back just in case I need some more, and mix some of this in. I might need more of that actually, I'm not sure if I've got enough. So what I'm trying to do now, I mean, you could argue that this is kind of hue. What I'm trying to match is the no hue on the Munsell chip. So what I end up with is the same value, but without the slightly bluish hue in this one and without the slightly brownish hue in this one. And then the same thing again, just get a little bit on the palette knife and dab it on there. You won't be able to see this as clearly as I can, but that's still a little too blue. So I'm just going to whack the rest of that I've got in there. I have a feeling I might not have enough umber, but I think this one would be close enough for the demonstration anyway. I don't want to spend all night sitting here mixing this colour. A little bit on the palette knife, a bit on the chip. Yeah, it's not bad. It is slightly blue, but I'll pick up a little bit of that. I could have done with mixing a little bit more of the burnt umber and titanium white mix, but it's close enough, so I'll pop that where the number 5 needs to go. So it's pretty much midway between this one and this one. And then I can just clean up my palette. So hopefully that has given you a really quick demonstration of how you can go about mixing and matching as accurately as you can a Munsell value. I say it's unfortunate that that went so quickly, because when I started learning this stuff, matching those values took me absolutely forever. I spent days trying to get them right and squinting at them and wondering if I was right or not. But it's like anything. After a while, if you do it enough, your sensitivity to value starts to develop, and you get better at it and you get faster. And I think you'll also find that you will see value more clearly too. Right, now I'm just going to get set up ready to paint now, so I'm just going to move my stool over to the other side, and I'll stay on this camera for some time now when I put this painting together, and we'll see how far we get. I'm going to do this for the people who were here last week in the still life painting webinar. I'm going to put this painting together in exactly the same sequence of steps as I did on the last one. So the first thing I do, obviously, is I need to rough it out. Now, I've had a little bit of a play with this already, and I've started roughing some stuff out. If I was doing this just for myself, I would probably be spending a little longer than I'm going to be able to spend on it today, making sure that it was as accurate as I could possibly get it. What I found I was slightly frustrated last week with the painting that I did, because I was desperate to spend more time on it and try and bring it to a higher level of finish. And some of the drawing was frankly abysmal, especially when I, excuse me, especially when I looked back at the video afterwards, and I thought, wow, that's some of the least accurate drawing that I've ever done. And it's probably going to be the same this week, but the main thing that I want to show you is, this isn't really a webinar on how to draw accurately, but you know, that is part of it. And being able to produce a reasonably accurate, fairly quick block in like this is part of the still life drawing. Perhaps I'll do a webinar just on that at some point. But for the moment, for today, I'm just going to put this in fairly quickly. just to give you an idea of how you can put something like this together. Now, actually, as I'm drawing this out, I'm already looking at the values, and interestingly, the top plane of the cube here, which is just over here, is almost exactly the same value as the background. And I love it when I see stuff like that, because it means that when I go to paint the edge of that top plane of the cube against the background, I can lose it completely and just paint it all as one value, go right across the edge. And I often find with stuff like that, it just gives it, there's something about it that just gives it a kind of a depth and a life. For this one, for the painting that I did last week, I had a black background. For this one, I put a piece of paper in the back of a slightly lighter value because these objects, I think they'll look a little too stark against the black background, and it will make it less easy to see, especially the shadow values. So this will, hopefully this slightly more middle value of a background will make it easy to see the values as I'm putting them in. One other thing I forgot to mention, actually, that I should, is very remiss of me, and I should have explained more clearly, and before I rough in the lemon, I'll do that now, is that the cube and the sphere and the lemon are all the same value. And the way that you can find the local value of something, I'm going to risk moving my lemon, and hopefully I'll be able to get it back into something like the same position, is with a little color isolator like this. And you'll see me use this later on to try and judge some of the values that I can see. I'll be holding it up like this. But it's also a really good way to isolate the value of something. Now, I've already tested this one so that I know that it's a value 7. And now just let me show you how I would do this with a value chip. It's basically by holding the color isolator up against the surface of the lemon or whatever it is. Obviously, this is much easier to do with something that's flat. And then looking until squinting, trying to find the right value using your value scale, whether it's one you've made yourself from a student book or one like I have here, really doesn't matter. Now that's about the right value. This is the value 6 in Munsell terms. That's a little darker. 7, too light. If I went all the way down to 5, it would probably be more obvious. Darker value than the local value. So the cube and the sphere are just about the same value as the lemon. I'm not actually sure if I put that back in the same place, which is why I wanted to get out and show you that. Now, the way to do this is basically once you've made your cube and your sphere, the sphere, by the way, is styrofoam, and I get them from art shops. They're pretty cheap. You can get a bunch of them without spending too much money. For the cube, I just went to my local timber merchants and asked them for a length of 2 by 2. And then just sawed off 2-inch lengths, made a bunch of cubes. For each of them, I coated them first, for the cube and the sphere. I coated them with acrylic gesso and then painted them with oil paint. Obviously matched to the values of the Munsell scale. What you can also do, and I'll be doing a webinar, I think next week I'm going to do a webinar on colour, how this stuff can help you with colour. And what you can also do is I could paint the sphere and the cube the same local colour, I could match the local colour of the lemon, and then do a study like this. And the reason a study like this is useful is because the cube is the most simplified of the three forms that we have here. So I can very clearly see three different planes. So I only really need three values to do a reasonable version of the cube. And that gives me a way into the sphere, which, because it's rounded, it's a bit more difficult to judge the values. So if I get the values right on the cube, then I know I'm going to be in the right ballpark for the sphere. So I'm basically painting the values of the cube on the sphere, but I'm modeling the form a little, so that when I come to the lemon, I've already had a little bit of practice. I know pretty much what the values I need are. I've got a reference already on my painted surface, and I'm much more likely to get close, because obviously if I just tried to do a value study of the lemon on its own, I've got the color information in there, which is going to throw things out a little for me. I've got to guess the values of the shadows and the light planes. And this way, it kind of gives me a way in. You still have to use your eyes. It won't get you all the way there. And there will be a lot of times where you simply can't match all the values that you see. Because the value range of paint is more limited than the value range we see in the world around us, even when you're just doing little indoor still lifes like this. I'm pretty sure that some of my measuring here is going to be wildly out, because I just really want to get this in and move on to the next stage without taking too long over it. But I also don't want to make too horrendous a job of it, because if I do, if the drawing's too bad, the values won't look right anyway. If I draw a plane and the value, the angle of the plane to the light isn't looking right in my drawing, then it's not going to help the level of realism. And what I'm really about here in this little series of webinars that I'm doing at the moment is to try and help you with some of the stuff that I've learned, which I think has helped me to get more realism into the paintings and the drawings I do. And of those things, I think value has made the most difference. So I've got a fairly clear shadow. This lemon is a little bit old, actually. I should have gone to the shops and got a fresh one before I started, but you know how it is, I ran out of time. And it's a little bit desiccated, but it does mean that it's got some quite sharp planes on it now, which is perhaps a useful thing, you know. So what I'm doing at the moment is, on the cube and the sphere, I'm just kind of roughing in where the main shadows are going to be. I think this would probably be good enough, you know, for this little demonstration. Although I'm sure much of it is wildly out. I'm also going to put in the cast shadows, because I paint those as part of the ground. There's some quite subtle shadows going on in here, actually, which is because some quite subtle value changes in the shadow, which is going to be interesting to try to catch. So I think that's probably all I'm going to need for the moment. The reason it's slightly off to the side is this kind of compromise that I need to do between what I can see and what you can see on the screen with the camera. I want the camera to be able to show the object, excuse me, and what I can see, and as close a viewpoint as I can while I'm still able to paint myself. So that's good enough, I think, to be roughed in. So the next point that I would do is to block in the background. Now this brings me to an interesting point, because I'm going to try to judge now using the isolator, holding it up. You can see it helps me to see exactly these little areas of value and to see what those little areas of value are. And the reason that this is so useful is because it takes out the context information from what I'm seeing and helps me to see just the value. Because actually, I put a blog post up today where I talked a little bit about this. I don't know if you've all seen it, where people do say that what you need to do when you're painting realistically, is to paint what you see, not what you know. But it's incredibly difficult to divide what you know from what you see, because perception is actually a combination of what we know and what we see. So whilst that advice is true to an extent, it's unlikely to make things any better for you. So what I'm going to do now, let's assume with me that you've got a little value scale done yourself, whether it's a Munsell value scale or it's your own value scale. I personally don't think it matters too much. I'd recommend doing a Munsell one because it gives you a target to match. But the main thing is that you have a little value scale with some little, and you make your own little chips like these Munsell chips that you can use. So as long as I hold my isolator always to the same angle to the light and at the same angle that my painted surface is, I can reliably say if this is a value 5 on here, I can find areas where it matches, where it's a value 5 there. Like you can see there, pretty much the same value. So I know that this area is about value 5, which is about the middle. And over here, you know, so I can probably paint a value 5 there, and it will be reasonably close. There are some subjects where it's much more difficult to do this, because this subject, most of it, if not all of it, is going to be within the range of paint. But when I get over here, obviously the value darkens quite a lot. Probably down to about as low as I can go. So let's get a chip out from the bottom of the Munsell scale, value 1, and see what we've got right over here in the corner. It's not quite a 1. I suspect it's a 2. Yeah, it's about a 2, I would say. So over here, I'm going to want something like a value 2. I don't think there's anything in this subject which is going to be outside the range of paint. So for this study, I'm going to be able to match fairly closely the values that I can see. So I'm going to be a 5 over here. It looks like it's gone slightly darker again over here, and then down to about a 2 over here. And that's given me, I think, enough information for me to start putting in the background. I appreciate this is going a little slowly at this time, but I'm trying to explain. Oh, excuse me, that's the cat asking to be out. I knew he was going to do that today. Go on then, little fella, off you pop. Cats always want to leave the room mid-webinar. Okay, I'm going to pop in some background value. Put a little bit of terps in with it. So here's my value 5 that you saw me mix earlier on. I know that's going to be somewhere around here, right? Because I just matched the value. It might not be perfect. And as I say, this isn't painting by numbers. I'm still going to have to use my eyes. If I want this painting to work. I think it's getting slightly darker when we get over to this corner, so let's pick up a little bit of 4. Again, this is something that I would probably do a little more, well, a lot more carefully if I wasn't trying to demonstrate as much as I can for you in the time that I have. You might be wondering why I don't use a toned ground. If you are, it's a good question. Sometimes I do. In fact, quite often I do. But lately I've found that when if I'm painting studies like this, a tone ground is kind of less important, because I know that I'm somewhere in the right area. And the values that I'm putting down look very dark to me at the moment, of course, because they're against the white ground of the surface that I'm painting on. But as I start to fill up the painting, as long as I don't make a complete pig's ear of it, we should start to see a feeling of light come in. So I'm going to go over here, so I know that where I need to go down here is to about value 2. I've picked up another brush for that, because I try and keep the brushes separated by value. Not one for each value, but I generally try and use 3 for whatever bits I happen to be painting. So I'll have a mid brush, a dark brush, and a light brush. You can use as many as you like. I've heard of people using much more complicated setups than that, but it at least has the advantage that you don't pollute the value that you're putting down with the one that you already have on your brush. It's interesting, even to me, as I'm painting this, I'm looking at that and thinking, whoa, that's dark. You know, I probably wouldn't, if I was just eyeballing this and I hadn't done much practice with values. So now I'm going to go up to 3, the next one along. To 4. Getting into the middle now, so I'm going to go with my mid brush back from 5 to 4. Because obviously what I have here is a mixture of the value I picked up and what was already on the brush. And I suspect this is why some people like to kind of to use a separate brush for each value. And you certainly could do it that way if you wanted to. But what I'm doing at the moment is kind of, I suppose you could say it's sort of a hybrid in a way. The value string, excuse me, is helping me to know where I am, broadly speaking, in the range of values. But I'm also doing a certain amount of mixing just on the on the painting itself. This will happen every now and again. I'll just be looking at something and I'll just zone out in the middle of a sentence. Sorry about that. If you've ever tried to talk and paint at the same time, or maybe you're good at it, I find it ridiculously difficult. This dark value here is pretty much continued around. Now, if I look too long at that value on the subject, it will I'll see it lighter than it really is, I think. But this would probably be a good point for me to start thinking about what the value is over here on the ground. But before I do that, again, if you were on the Still Life Painting One webinar last week, you would have seen me do this before. As I get out one of these, which is a dry brush. This is a Mongoose filbert, and just quickly average these out a little. Just blend it a little bit so it doesn't shout at me too much. And a good way to do that, I find, is to hatch it a little bit and then smooth across the hatches. You can actually get a fairly reasonable blend without spending the whole day on it. And I'm rubbing off the brush as I go to try and keep it reasonably dry. Yeah, I'm not going to spend forever on this. I usually spend perhaps a little bit longer on making that a little neater. Right, so there's a background in. Conscious that I'm already coming up to an hour. I'm afraid I never really know how long these things are going to take. I think I block them in for an hour usually. The last one was 2 hours. This one's probably going to be at least an hour and a half before I get too much further. But stick around if you can, because the interesting bit happens when I start to put in the shadow planes. But what I want to know now is the value of this area here, the ground. I suspect it's a little lower than 5. I'm just looking at it. It does look quite a bit lower. Let's get one that's about 4. Again, I'm still trying to make sure that I always hold this up the same value, the same angle, sorry, as my framer and my drawing board, my painting surface, so that it always has the same amount of light falling on it, because I may be able to match it fairly closely, but if I angle it the other way, suddenly it's darker than the value I'm looking at. If I angle it that way, suddenly it's lighter. So it's really important. That obviously will throw you out completely. So it's really important to make sure that you always hold it at the same angle. Actually a little darker than that. I think we might be somewhere between a 3 and a 4. Let's go with 4, because I think it's only just a little bit below. So same thing again. Use my mid brush. This one. 1, 2, 3, 4. Pick up some 4. I'm not going to bother to fill the whole thing in, because I won't need to do it, just to get a good idea of whether the values overall are logical, and whether they're working, whether I'm getting a reasonable impression of light. You won't have to go much further than this. This is terribly slapdash, but hopefully it will be enough to give you an idea. So I'm going to go now down to 3, because what I need to do now is to get this kind of, I need to get this to disappear into this darker value. I'll get some 2 with my dark brush. So I paint it kind of almost in stripes really, and then pick up this dry brush again. Hatch it a bit. One of the reasons for building up the painting in this very systematic way, always in the same series of steps: background, ground, cast shadow, shadow planes, light planes, is that I can do some fairly bold blending of that edge there without disturbing, because there's nothing on here yet, without disturbing that too much. Somewhere close there, I think. a strong feeling I'm going to need to go lighter on the ground at some point, but let's see. So the next thing I want to put in is the cast shadows, because the cast shadows belong to the ground, not to the objects themselves. At this point, I'm going to move to a smaller brush. Any opportunity I have to go on about these brushes, I do. This is Rosemary's brush. It's a mongoose long filbert. Look how long the hair is on that brush. Absolutely lovely brush. I know that I'm going to be painting most of the rest of that with these, so I'm going to get 3 of them up. They're all the same size. I buy my brushes in 3s, so one can be for the darks, one for the lights, and one for the middles. Middles, I don't know what you'd call it. So the value there of the cast shadows, I could use the isolator on it. Let's use the isolator on it actually, because I'd probably just go and guess that it's about a 2 or a 3. But let's have a look and check, because what I'm supposed to be doing for you here is demonstrating how you could do this exercise yourself. So I'm trying to hold that over, looking at the screen to see what you can see, because obviously I see it from a slightly different angle, but I'm going to have to do it from my... That's about right, actually. That one's slightly lighter. The cast shadow from the lemon is looking to be about a 2. Value 2. Somewhere between a 2 and a 3, the cast shadow from the sphere, and the same for the cube. Now I know some people might think that this working in this way, measuring values and putting them in like this, is somehow kills your creativity. But don't forget that what I'm doing at this point is I'm not trying to make a painting. I'm not trying to produce a piece of art. What I'm trying to do is to learn about values. This is practice. It's drill. It's like a golfer practicing their swing, or a musician practicing scales. And I think there's almost a kind of a suspicion among visual artists of this kind of practice, which I think is a big shame, because if you get to a point where you have a really good command of values, it means that you don't have to worry too much about it, and you'll have to use less of your brain power as you're painting on trying to figure out how to get the values right, and you'll be able to devote more time to how you want to paint the piece, to the creative aspects of painting on the fly as you paint. And I think for me that's really the value of this kind of practice, is that it frees you up. It's freeing, really. It's not limiting, it's freeing. Similarly with being able to draw accurately, if you have to spend your entire time while you're drawing, I'm going to go up a little bit there because I'm pretty sure the value is high. They're just eyeballing. If you have to spend your whole time struggling with being able to get an accurate drawing down, you're not going to be able to have so much brain power left over for thinking about things like how you handle the paint, how you want to approach this piece. If there's any kind of a message that you want to be bringing out, the feeling you want to evoke. Whereas if you don't have to worry so much about drawing values, getting reasonably close with the colour, then you will be able to spend more time on those things, and you'll create more beautiful work. So at this point, I've got a fair amount in, and I'm going to do another little bit of blending, because what I usually do for these studies is to finish the cast shadows kind of as much as I can, because for the same reason that I did this bit over here, because I have a lot more freedom still at this point. So I've got the same thing again, a smaller mongoose fill, but this one is really worn, and I love it for this kind of stuff. So similarly, what I would probably do if I was spending more time is put a couple of value perhaps in between to step it, but I'm just going to kind of go through this quickly. So I'll hatch it and then drag it like I did before, but hatch it more as we get further away from the object to replicate that kind of the fact that cast shadows get softer the further away you get from the object. And you can kind of, you can drag the shadow into the lighter value of the ground, or the other way around, and you can kind of push the paint around a little bit if you want to get closer to I've got a bit of a problem over here with the drawing. And there's a slightly lighter value coming in just here before the shadow comes in. And then it gets a bit darker at the top. Yep, right at the back. It may seem overly fiddly to be worrying about bits like this at this point, but if I don't have to worry about them later, it'll make things go more easily. I can already see that my drawing of the cube is pretty horrendous. So you'll just have to bear with me, I think, for some of this. Hopefully you'll be able to pick up some interesting and useful stuff nonetheless. And what you also find, of course, on rounded objects is that there's a darker bit where it goes right down, where there's no light at all showing, and it goes right down to black, right underneath each object. So I'm just going to pop in a little bit of black on the underside. Again, if my drawing is out here, which I know it is, there will be some issues with this working properly, this little bit here, but nonetheless, I'll pop it in at this stage so that you can see that it would go in. Oh dear. I don't know if you can see that, but I'm going to have to switch off from the main camera for a second because it's telling me that it's running out of battery. So I'll just, I have a backup battery here. So I'll just go back on to the main camera for a second while I just swap the battery over. Sorry about the delay. It would possibly be a good point to ask if there are any questions about what's been happening so far. just going to have to take a minute to set the camera up again in the focus. So if you could just bear with me for a second while I do that, it won't take me very long. Okay, we should be set up with that camera again now. So hopefully that gives you some idea at this point. We're a little bit over time and I haven't actually painted anything in the objects yet. The next bit which is going to go in is the shadow planes. But let me... Yeah, the battery. Yeah, someone noticed it flashing. I think we're all right. I always have a backup battery ready just in case. This is actually the first time I've had to use one. Hopefully we're going to be okay. So are there any really burning questions at this point about what I've done so far? Yes, I use 3 brushes for every color. So if this was if I was painting a lemon and an orange and a pot, I would have 3 brushes for each, for the darks, the middles and the lights for each one. I have my Munsell paints tubed up. What I mean by that is I mix up a load of, you can buy empty tubes. I think I've got one over here. Here's an empty tube. And you mix up a big wad of paint, stick it all in the top there, crimp it out, fold it over and crimp it with pliers, and hey presto, you end up with something like this. Your own value, really handy because it means you don't have to mix up those values every time you paint. Now that we've got Munsells, yes, Munsells, not muscles. Okay, so let's see. I'm going to have a quick look and see if the camera, the paint cam, should be working again now. Yeah, we're back with this camera. So apologies that this is going on a little bit longer than an hour. I think what I'm going to have to do is I'm just going to have to start saying these are going to be at least an hour and a half before I can get anywhere through the study, given all the yakking that I do at the beginning. And I think the last one last week went to 2 hours. I got to a point where I thought I'm really stretching it now and it was time to stop, but most people still wanted me to continue. So I kept going for a little while. And actually you find with these kind of studies, it's like the hard work is kind of done now in a way, in that I've got a lot of the value in. I've got the context set, if you like. I've got something in there which I know is, excuse me, at least reasonably close. Just going to make a little adjustment around there. One thing, I don't know if this is worth mentioning, but there's 2 things that I often find when I work this way. And if you have a go at this way of working, you can tell me if you find it too. With values, I sometimes find that even when I'm measuring them, when I put them in, some of them I need to adjust up after a little while. Because once I see them actually in the painting, they look like they're a little too dark. And with colour, I sometimes find that even though I'll have the little isolator, which ought to get me very close, I'll find that I'll need to add more chroma to get something close to what I can see. I'm just lightening a couple of values here. I've got to be careful how much of this I do at this point, because of course I don't have the whole painting in. I've still got white bits of canvas pads showing, which is going to be throwing out my perception of the values on the painting itself. So let's go in and do the shadow planes. Now I'm going to start with the cube first, because it's the simplest one to do, because it has a big flat area of tone. Can I point to it? Yeah, that there. So that's the one that I want to get next. We're probably looking at about a value 3. It's quite close to the cast shadow. I would say it's about a 3. Of course, you won't see. Can I hold that over? Slightly lower, perhaps. Slightly lower than a 3. This is one of those funny things. What I'm trying to do is, if I hold this in my line of sight over that area of the cube, you see it slightly to one side. So I have to kind of look at what the camera sees behind me and try and get it over the right area. But I think it's about a 3, possibly slightly lower. Again, this is getting me generally more in the ballpark. And when I have everything blocked in, I'm still going to need to do quite a bit of adjustment by eye. And that's kind of the fun part. It's where you... Sorry, I'm just picking up a little bit of extra terps. It's where you can do the little bits that help really to make it pop out. Okay, so I'm going to pick up 1, 2, 3, between the 3 and the 4. And let's just whack it in and see how it looks. Because I have something already to thin that a bit. It's quite warm in here. I think the paint is actually drying on the palette. I have something to judge it against now. So I'll be able to see as this is going in how much adjustment I might need to do. I'm especially interested in looking at how this value looks against the value that I've got in the background there. Little dark. I just changed that because I went in with a 3. When I looked at it against the background value, it just looked a bit dark. So that's, I guess that's kind of a case in point of what I was trying to say before, where the isolator and the chips, I use them as a guide, if you like, and I think that's how they're most useful, to put you in the general ballpark, which enables you to make better judgments, I think, about the value that you're trying to create. I'm just going to have a quick check of the background value behind the cube. And the value of the top plane of the cube. Oh, it's about 5. which is about what I've got there. So I'll trust it for the time being and play with it a little while if I need to. So what I actually ended up with on the shadow plane of the cube was going in with about a 3, which I've got about here. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to bang it in fairly roughly for the sphere and for the lemon. It's worth bearing in mind, because of the way the object is set up, there's a little bit of reflected light from the cube bouncing back into the shadow side of the sphere. And the same for the lemon. I'll do the same, painting similar value for the shadow plane. Of the lemon. There's a bit more reflected light there, so I'll pop a little bit extra in. And you can start to see, hopefully at this point, that a little bit of the feeling of light is starting to appear. Where I'll usually go next is the midtones now. For the cube, what I would say the representative kind of midtone is that top plane. It has less light falling on it than the front plane. And it's pretty much the same value as the background there. So I'm not going to mess about with it, I'm just going to paint it. I'm not worried too much about the edges. Lost edges are a really wonderful thing in painting, that there's something about them that just give the painting depth and life. Just very quick. So that top plane there on the cube will correspond roughly to a value which will be about here. So there's a point about the top of the sphere there where the value meets the value of the background. And it will be something like that. And there will obviously be a dark value. In the halftone as it moves towards the shadow. For the lemon, I think that's next door neighbours. Can you hear the next door neighbours? I'm actually at home in my living room at the moment. We'll have a similar value at the top there, but it's going to show a little more against the background because the background is a darker value there. How are we doing? Coming up to 25 past. Okay, what I'm going to do from here, because we're kind of, it's getting a little bit pushed for time, I'm going to do the rest of this fairly quickly. Our objects are beginning to appear. Although I would generally not do much blending, and I would rather paint values in between. For sake of speed on this one, I'm just going to do just a quick bit to see these values kind of move across the surface of these forms a little, so that it doesn't look too far out when I put the light planes in. So I'm going to judge the light plane of the cube now. It's obviously at the top end of the range. So let's say, is it about an 8? I would say it's probably about an 8. 7. Probably more like 8. So I'll get another fresh brush, because I'm going to be painting into the lights now. Pick up some 8. Now I tend to, when I get to the light bits, I've been painting fairly thinly up until now. When I get to the light bits, I tend to paint more thickly. It just seems to give the painting a bit more solidity and texture. And when you think about it, you do see more texture in the lights. I think it's something that Andrew Loomis talks about in one of his books. I think it's in Creative Illustration. He has something he calls the form principle, and some of the things he says are actually wrong. I have to say, as uncomfortable as I feel at disagreeing with someone who knows as much or knew as much as Andrew Loomis and is so influential. One of the things he says in Creative Illustration is that the number of steps between the shadow plane and the light plane on an object is always the same, no matter what the local value. So if you have a black object, the number of steps between the shadow and the light plane is the same as it is on a white object, and it's just not true. And that's one of the things that I discovered through doing a bunch of this kind of practice with cubes and spheres, is that it's the value range of a white object from the shadow plane to the light plane is greater than that of a black object. There's something like, might actually be a little bit bright, but that's okay. So I think it's not too far. So that plane of the cube, given the angle that it's at to the light, the corresponding bit of the sphere is about there. So, oh, a bit of a slip there. As you can see, I'm rushing to try and get this in. So for the sphere, that's probably going to be the lightest bit. And likewise for the lemon. Because the lemon is backing into shadow a little bit, and the back edge, the lightest bit is probably going to be about there. So at this point for me, I've no doubt that there's formulas that you could use to get really close with this. But I tend to just look at what's there. And if I've done a reasonable job up to this point of judging the values and I'm in the general ballpark, then this stage I ought to be able to do a little bit more judging by eye. Be able to get reasonably close. As I said, now what I would usually do at this point is spend quite a bit of time not actually blending on the sphere, but putting in more and more values in between, which has the effect of modeling the form. Conscious that I'm very much going over time here, really, so I don't want to try your patience too much. The main things I guess that I wanted to show you, I've shown you most of at this point, which is the method of setting up the still life and judging the values. So what I'm going to do in a minute is one of those things I always do on TV, and I'm going to say that here's one I prepared earlier. Because beyond this point, and similarly for the 11.2, it's mostly a case of refining what you have. But we're beginning to get a bit more of a feeling of the light coming into it now, and the form. It helps whilst I'm doing this painting. Most of the time I have my eyes thrown out of focus, and for a value study most of the time I'm squinting. So you might try blurring your eyes a little. The screen may be blurring it enough for you anyway, I'm not sure. Should show you. Take out a lot of the clumsiness of the paint at this point and show just the values. But at this point, I've got most of it in, most of the values in, so I can start to get an idea of what I need to change and what is working. One of the main things that strikes me at the moment is that I think particularly on the sphere I need some lighter values around here, but it's got a little bit dark before it goes into the half tone around there. So I really would, at this point, I would spend quite a bit of time just adjusting the paint, adjusting the values across the surface of the object, modeling the form a little better. but I'm actually at an hour and a half now, which I don't want to try your patience. Hopefully that has been enough at that point to show you how I put these together and the basic approach. And as I said, I was going to show you one that I did before, and this is almost the same thing, similar kind of setup, but is obviously a little more finished, which I spent a little bit more time on. But this was painted using exactly the same sphere and cube, a different lemon in the same shadow box, and using exactly the same technique as I've used to put this one together. It was a slightly different setup. And there are certainly, looking at this now, there are certainly some things that I would change about the values I have in here. This is the bit I got to this point last time where I just wanted to keep painting, because immediately I can start to see areas that I need to change. And you know, you just want to, you don't want to leave them. You want to spend a bit more time on them. But I think at this point, I've hopefully demonstrated how I would approach a study like this. Background definitely needs to come up there. So really, I mean, from this point on, it would just be about making adjustments until I really felt that I was much closer to what I could see, and then refining the shape until I get something which is starting to live on the canvas. But at this point, bar the drawing is actually quite terrible, but bar some changes I need to make here and there, which of course I can't resist making a couple of as soon as I see them. There's a much darker area of value around here, which is, I think, it's a cast value of the lemon on the back wall, if you like, which I would certainly need to be putting in. But hopefully that's been reasonably instructive and just giving you some ideas for some stuff that you can try yourself. So I think at this point we've got enough in, so I'm going to go back to the main camera. And we'll pop over onto the chat. Now, if any of you do have any questions about anything that I've done there, now is a really good time to ask them. Basically, I'll stay on as long as you want me to now. If there's anything that you feel needs clarifying, that you're not too sure about, let me know in the chat, and I'll do my best to answer your questions as well as I can. Yeah, someone said, interesting how your eye completes the top plane of the square without actually being painted. Yeah, I love that stuff. It does happen. And that's I think that's a good example of, there is actually no edge painted there at all. I would do a little bit more detail in there, because I can see a little bit of an edge when I look at the subject. But that's a really good case of perception being a combination of what we see and what we know. We infer from the context that there's a top plane of the cube there, and you can kind of feel that it's there, even though it really isn't. I didn't paint that edge at all. I just brought the background straight down onto the top. Maybe a few pointers on how to judge the grey value of the lemon, please. Yeah. A really good exercise for getting good at that. A lemon is a fairly high chroma object. Okay. So let's say, I mean, I've got a cube here, which is a slightly lower chroma. Now I should have a Munsell chip which is pretty much, this one is the exact match. The nice thing about having these different Munsell chips, the handy thing about it is that I can look at the back of this and I know that that's it's value 6. So I can pick up, if I can find it, underneath the palette. I can get my value 6 from my Munsell scale, and I know that that's the right value. That is the local value, but it's a tricky thing to do at first. Again, it's something that you get better at with practice over time. And the best thing to do is to start with some flat surfaces. So the cubes are handy because obviously it's a flat surface. So I can actually put the chip underneath there. And if you squint, it takes out most of the color information. And you can judge values like that. This is way too far away from you, I think, but I'm going to lose the light if I bring it too close. A really good exercise is to start, before you try and do something like this where you're using an isolator to judge values like that, I would do an exercise where you're getting something flat. Book covers are good for this, or sketch pads. Here's the back of a sketch pad, okay? So start by practice by judging local colors first, what the value of that is, because that's quite low chroma, okay? So if I can find the correct value chip for this. Too dark. Unfortunately, I have to hold this at this angle to the light so you can see it, which also means with a color checker, there's a bit of a shadow there, which makes it awkward. I don't ordinarily hold it straight to the light. It's fairly close, but I suspect it's probably a little bit lighter than that. And that was value 6 actually. So it's probably closer to 7. Again, I can hold the isolator over it. Yeah, I think that's pretty close. It's probably about a 7. And a really good exercise you can do is to just get a bunch of things like this with an isolator, get some charcoal or some pencil and a pad, and guess that value. Draw a little square, not right next to it, away from it. Draw a little square and guess the value, and try and shade in a nice smooth value that you think is the match of that, and then bring it back and judge it against this value. Put it right against it and see how close you came. And the reason that's so useful, it's the same as with measuring. It's the guess then measure approach. It gives you immediate feedback on how closely you've judged that value. So if you judge it too light, as I find, and the people that I've worked with doing this exercise with people, most people judge values too light, and you have to go a little bit darker to get them right. So gradually, bit by bit, you can build up your sensitivity. So when you're doing something like this, it tends to work much better. How might you translate this into other media, pencil, charcoal, particularly the blending? A lot of the value studies that I did that were more like this kind of thing were done with charcoal and chalk, with a kind of a mixed blending method. Now, I first came across this in the work of Kate Salmons, her drawing, and she produces the most unspeakably beautiful paintings, really gorgeous work, and her drawings are fantastic as well. And she trained with Anthony Waichulis, who actually, I've just got hold of his materials for his curriculum, which I'm about to start working through. And he takes a very similar approach to practice, has a very similar idea about practice as I do, where you take out discrete areas of painting and drawing, and you have exercises to practice the discrete skills to build those skills, and then with feedback from the exercises, you develop that particular skill. And Kate was kind enough to describe to me on an art form, this is a little while ago, how she layered the chalk, the black and white chalk, to make all of the values. And you can get a value range that's actually quite close to the value range of paint. So the first value exercises that I started doing using an isolator like this were the ones that I showed you earlier on in the slides at the beginning. And they were drawn and they were value exercises. You can do it with pencil, of course, but pencil has quite a narrow value range. It means you have to do a lot more translating. So in fact, although people tend to default to pencil, I actually think in some ways it's a more difficult medium than charcoal and chalk to use. Let's have a quick look at some more. Do you use nitrum or vine? Both. Actually, when I was doing the mixed ones, I think I used, some of them I used a charcoal pencil, Conte, and pastel, white pastel, and some of them I used this Krita color. I forget what they called it now, but it was just like pastel basically, but just with a little more binder. But if I'm just drawing, just doing charcoal stuff, generally speaking, I'll just use willow charcoal. But I do have some of that posh nitrum stuff as well if I want to get really, you know, above my station and think that I deserve that kind of quality material. Could you offer a recommended reading list on the subject of value by email? That's a good question. Now, there is a book, although I actually haven't read it, but I've heard brilliant things about it, called Values for Pictures Worth 1,000 Words. And I forget who the author is, but you have to write to him because he doesn't do email or anything. And he was quite an old guy when I last heard about it. So you might look that up and you might be able to find a copy of that somewhere. I'm trying to think who else might be useful in terms of value. To be honest with you, I think the best thing to do is the most useful thing I've found for learning values is to learn empirically from the real world, from setups in front of you. Get some cubes and spheres, paint them different values, and do some studies of them. And nothing will take you further, I don't think, than doing that. You gain a real understanding about the difference between the range of values that you see in your subject and the range that you can get with your materials, and how you have to translate. It's honestly the best practice I've done, and brought me from really struggling with value to being much more comfortable with it. But it took some time as well, I must say. That thing the slides that I flicked through quickly earlier on, I think there was about 2 years separating them. So, you know, there's quite a bit of practice in there too. Didn't you have to balance the light on the composition on your easel? Yes. Someone's put in Anthony White-Tulis' stuff there. Yeah, check it out. Anthony White-Tulis' stuff, Language of Drawing and Language of Painting. He's basically put his entire curriculum onto DVD for you, and I've only just got it myself, and I've just started looking at it, and it looks absolutely fantastic, I have to say. I can't recommend it from any point of knowing it, but because I haven't worked with it much yet, and that's when you really learn about something, but I do intend to. And I know Anthony from Facebook, and I've been really impressed with the stuff he writes, with his approach, the way he thinks about practice and the way he thinks about art and developing skill. I just think he's got it absolutely right. And if you have a look at his own work, which is always a good barometer, I think, of whether you should listen to someone's advice or not, it's incredible. He does trompe-l'oeil painting, which is like at the extreme end of trying to make something look real. And they're great. Oh, Values for Pictures Worth 1,000 Words, Apollo Dorian. You can get a Kindle edition. That's fantastic. That's £27 and 2 pence I'm about to spend, probably before the night is over. Thank you very much, James, for putting that in. What size brushes do you use? Well, a variety really, but for stuff about this size, for most of the time when I was painting the objects, I used these. They are Rosemary's brushes, and it's a size 3. It's a size 3 filbert. I think I got 9 of those at once because, you know, you might be painting 3 objects at the same time, and I want dark to light to shadow for all of those 3 objects. If the scene has a greater range of light to dark than your palette, how do you compress the values to match? What an excellent question. I struggled with this one for a long time, and I've done a huge amount of, investigation about it. And there are different approaches. The most common approach that people take to it is they say, well, do an even compression, and that's how you'll probably get closer. And 9 times out of 10, I think that's probably true, but it's not the only thing you can do. So let me, oh, the cat's coming back. Hello, little fella. This is a little study I did a long time ago when I was first learning all of this stuff. And I was doing my first experiments with value, and it's basically a little study of a white cube done from 2 different perspectives, 2 different ways of compressing the values. So both of these planes are the same value. They're both white, titanium white, okay? But what I did was I measured down how many steps in between each value using the isolator and the Munsell chips. And this one is done from the top down. So I started there and I measured the difference between that plane and that plane, and then the difference between that plane and that plane, and then the difference between that value and that value. For this one, I started at the bottom, so I started there. I matched that one as closely as I could and then went up. So in this one, the dark end of the value range is compressed, and in this one, the light end of the value range is compressed. So it's like, imagine you've got a scale from light at the top and dark to bottom. You've taken the middle, and if you're doing this one, you've pushed the middle up. So you've got more room in your darks. It results in a lighter painting overall, closer to a kind of impressionist feel, the kind of value schemes that Turner would use, whereas this is closer to the kind of classic old master Rembrandt type thing, where you have a sharp area of light against an overall darker background. And you can play with that stuff. You don't have to stick to the exact value relationships you see, but woe betide you if you get any of these wrong. You have to do this very logically, or you destroy the feeling of reality. But generally speaking, there was a question earlier on about balancing the light between the subject and oh, I'm sorry about that. The cat's been sick. All right, little man. It all happens on live webinars, you know. All right, little fella. I think he's all right. I think he's just eating a bit too much. That'll be interesting on the soundtrack of this on YouTube. Live cat sick, as we talk. But anyway, what was I saying? Yeah, balancing the lights and darks. Now, the way that I do that, it's absolutely crucial when you're doing this stuff. So you want to make sure that you can hit as much of the range that you see in your subject as you can, especially if you're trying to paint something white, you know, because that's going to stretch the top of your value range. And I generally find it's most important to be able to hit as much of the light area as you can. Stage fright, you reckon? Yeah, it probably was. Poor little fella. You all right? Yeah, I think he's okay. So I've got 2 little value strips here. Ivory black, titanium white, Munsell 5. Can put 1 in the subject. Try and get it to stand up. You know, you can actually, let's do it as I would usually do it. And I'll show you. Get a bit of blue tack, wedge it on the back. And I can stick that there, and I can get that at pretty much the same angle to the light as my painting surface is. And then I can scan across from here to the scene behind and see if it looks like I can hit the range values. The other thing I'll do is I'll have one of those in there, get another one, and stick it on the painting surface like that. And it's a really handy way to check that you've got a decent balance, because I remember a long time ago, I'll tell you just a quick story, when I was trying to learn to paint realistically again, and I just started, and I was really struggling, and I set up my easel. I was painting a plum, and I was painted by natural light by a window, and I thought that the plum looked really nice with the light behind it. So I set up my easel, but of course the painting surface was in shadow because I was facing the window, because the light was falling from the other side of the plum. And I could not paint that plum no matter how I tried. And it took me some time to realize that it was because I hadn't bothered doing any of this. And I was trying to match what I saw. I was, you know, I had this idea like you do when you start, oh yeah, you just got to paint what you see, right? You're simple, you know, I just got to get the colors right and it'll work. This kind of stuff throws all of that out. But if you've got something like this set up, you can also use, I've put it somewhere, I'm afraid, but you can also use your little, here we go, the little isolator, you know, to check what the values actually look like and check that you've got the same over here and you've got here. So if my easel is angled away from the light, it drastically changes the perception of the values here. So you do have to be really careful about that. Love Rosemary brushes. Yeah, me too. Buy Rosemary brushes, they're brilliant. Oh, now here's an interesting thing. Mick Carney says, interesting question about the range of values. Photography has the same problem. The film can't cope with the actual value range. Absolutely true. Ansel Adams' writings in the negative print and the print are useful. Brilliant. I'll check that out. It's one of the reasons why I would suggest doing value studies like this from a photograph is not a very good idea, because the camera will already have compressed the range of values for you, especially if you printed it off. It might be different if it's on a computer screen. I think they have a wider gamut, but it will already have compressed the values for you. So you won't have to do that work. You won't have to figure out all of that stuff about values, and you probably end up replicating the value compression that the camera has used, and it might not always be what you want. So I would always, for these kind of studies, I would always work from life. Have you ever used a spotlight meter? No, because I don't even know what one of those is. I suspect that that's something from photography. The lights that I'm using at the moment actually are photographic lights. They're not hugely expensive. They have, each one has 4 excuse me, there's 4 of those high energy daylight fluorescents in it, and then there's a soft box over the top of it to diffuse the light a little bit. But I'm sure there's lots of other stuff that you could use as well. Let me just scroll up a little bit to see if I've missed anything. Is chalk different from pastel? I suspect it's only different in the kind of binder that they use, and therefore the feel of it on the page. Have I missed any questions? Unfortunately, there's been quite a lot of questions come through, and there's it's really nice that there's a lot of activity in the chat, but it's very easy for me to miss stuff. Oh, Terry asked, could you clarify what the local color is? Yes, sorry, I should have done that immediately. So the local color of this cube is this. If I put something flat against it and I match the color exactly, that's the color that I would paint this cube. You know, if I want to paint something the same color as that lemon, then I would match the color of that lemon, which is the local color, and then paint it. The perceived color changes depending on how much light is falling on something. So you could think of the local color as being the color of something in an even light, without thinking about whether it's in light or shadow or not. So if you want to paint something this particular color orange, that's the local color. Hopefully that explains it. Are you working on a tone relation or a single tone? I'm not sure what you mean by that. If you could clarify that a little bit, or perhaps email me if you'd like to. Never painted in oils. What's your preferred medium? Oils definitely. I've used acrylic and stuff like that. Excuse me, the cat's demanding attention again. Gouache, quite a nice medium to work with. I've done pastels. I actually used to do, a long time ago, I used to do copies of old master paintings on the pavements in pastels, and learnt quite a bit that way. Used to use really good quality pastels. Made quite good money as well. You just put a hat out, you know. Excuse me. So a lot of different mediums I've tried, but oils I much prefer. There's just, I think the range of values is so good, and they tend to stay reasonably close to the values they are after they've dried, once they're varnished. Someone asked if you use 3 brushes per colour. I would tend to use 3 brushes per local colour per object. An interesting thing, actually, next week I'm doing a webinar on colour, and I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to demonstrate how you can take this kind of thing one step further. I'm sorry I can't show you the cat. He's gone out. If he comes back in, I'll pick him up and you can see him. Yeah, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick something like an apple or a pear that has 2 different locals and show how I would approach modeling each of those colors from light to dark across the form, which works really, really well. And in that situation, I would use 3 brushes for each of those local colors from light to midtones to shadow. So for one object, if it had 2 main locals, if you like some apples do or pears do, then I would use 6 brushes to paint it. A question about Munsell color swatches. I think I've missed that one, and I don't think I've much chance of finding it. If you have a really, I'm gonna really have to stop soon, but if you have a really burning question about something and I've missed it, pop it in the chat now and I'll answer it. I'll stay on for another 5 minutes or so. But it's actually it's quite late for me in the UK now, and I'm starting to struggle a bit with my voice, full of cold at the moment, unfortunately. When you do the one on colours, please spend a lot of time on green. Joan, yeah, Joan, I know what you mean. Greens are a struggle. They really are a struggle. And the interesting thing about greens is one of the things I found when I started doing a lot of stuff with Munsell, that it's very difficult to hit a chroma high enough in the lower values of green. And that is a challenge with paint, I find. You can do it with a very blue-green, but with the more yellowish greens, it's hard to get the chroma high enough in the shadow things. So yeah, I'll probably do a pair then, and then we'll get to see some green in action. Do you use Munsell color swatches then for color as well? Yes, for studies, yes. And I've done quite a bit of practice with color in the same way that I've done this kind of practice with value. And I would also credit that in the same way as this. I credit this practice with helping me to get much better at value, to get much better at color. But I would definitely do the value thing first, because value is most of color. And if you can get a good handle on value, you'll find hue and chroma to be less of a challenge than trying to do it all at the same time. Thank you. Yellow greens, yeah, they are hard. Yellow greens are hard. It's just difficult to get the chroma. Medium, as in, it looks like there was a question about. It looks like there was a question about what medium I used. Oh, really simple. I just have a little bit of linseed oil, cold pressed linseed oil, and a little bit of terps. I know some people don't like terps, and that's fine. Use whatever you want to use to thin it down if you want to thin it down. Personally, I love the smell of terps. There's something about it. It's just to walk into a room, it smells of pure gum terps, and then memory, I think, has strong associations with smell, and I have some really good ones with terps because I love to paint. So I just use a little bit of cold pressed linseed oil, a little bit of terps, and depending if I'm painting on something over more than one day, or if I'm painting more than one layer, I'll just up the level of oil, so that the basic fat over lean approach. Does a final varnish affect the values much? It does a little bit, but if the relationships are right, I personally haven't found any problems with it. It depends on a lot of things. I mean, if you've got sinking in on your painting, that affects the values terribly. And then when you put the varnish on, if you've got bad sinking in, that would even still affect the varnish. But a lot of the time when I'm painting, I use, I probably shouldn't say this and people will damn me for it, but I use Marigé medium quite a bit. because it has the big advantage that apart from things drying quite quickly because it's got lead in it, you get a very even kind of a finish to it, and that works really well too. So the varnish shouldn't affect it too much as long as they're quite good. Okay, I'm really going to have to wrap up now. Thanks very much, everybody, for showing up. It continues to amaze me that we can even do this, that I can just sit and paint for you and answer your questions for people from all over the world. Thank you for coming. I really hope you found it useful. There will be a recording of the webinar. This is a Google Hangout, so it will be on YouTube, and I'll send you out a link by email tomorrow for everyone who registered for the webinar. So if you want to, you can grab it. And what I did last week was I downloaded an MP4 of the video, and then I stuck it on Dropbox, so you can download it and keep it in perpetuity if you like to, for as long as you like. Thanks so much for coming, and thanks for all your kind words and your brilliant questions. And hopefully I'll see you all next week. It's probably going to be the same time. Hopefully my voice will be in better shape and my cold will be gone, and I'm going to do one on color. Hopefully I'll see you then. Thanks very much.